I've spent a lot of time with a lot of merchants and heard a lot of those stories. In some cases, in more depth with some more colorful words behind closed doors
Right, right, right.
about things that have gone well and not gone as well.
Dude, I'm asleep by like 9:30, 10 o'clock, something like that, you know?
Yeah.
I've always been
So
kind of
for
an early bird.
my wife works until around 6, and it's very close. But and she works for a nonprofit where the kids also are in daycare and preschool, respectively.
Right.
And so they get home, plus or minus 6, give or take, depending on the day of the week. Um, and then we've got to bathe and feed and do all the usual. And then once my daughter's in bed at 8 something, then it's time to do the dishes and do the laundry and do, normal
All the
household
stuff.
things.
Yeah.
And then I've got to start to try to wind down. And so, I can't possibly fall asleep at 9, 10 o'clock. I haven't even,
Haven't even
right?
begun to ramp down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I grew up in New York and I was always a late night guy. And I mean, it was just kind of normal.
Yeah. Are you a
Are,
developer? Is your background as a
I,
developer or?
I'm not by trade. And so, I mean, in school, dating, I mean, but by the third grade, they were pulling me out of class for an hour a day to help the computer teacher. So, back in junior high, high school, college, I did, basic, Q basic, Sinclair basic,
Q
C++.
Basic.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
I
was
love
my
Q
first.
basic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then C++ and what have you. I can read some HTML and that sort of thing, like, especially for where SEO is concerned, the meta information and other stuff. But um, I do a better job of translating tech between everyone else and developers than I do developing myself. And you'll appreciate this because I know that you have a deeper background on that side. There's language involved. I speak 2 languages, English and worse English. I'm a typical New Yorker, right? you okay, like that's it. You call someone that speaks 3 languages trilingual, 2 languages bilingual, 1 language American. Like that's all that they taught me. Um, yeah, I I think as I switched schools growing up, I went from French to Hebrew to Spanish. I kept jumping around. I never perfected anything, and I think I feel the same way about coding. That I never really stuck with anything long enough to be to think in code.
Mhm.
And so, the good side of it is that I really understand relational databases and logic statements and other things in a way that I understand why something might be possible or might not, or where some of the challenges are going to arise, where something's going to break down.
Mhm.
I've spent time, I'm an agile scrum master. I've project managed, different projects. I've had different experience in all sorts of facets, from the sales and account management and project management, and as sort of a super admin. Um, when it comes to some of these platforms like Magento, WordPress, etc., uh, there's a lot of a lot of time on the marketing side. So I've been certified umpteen ways by Google and other platforms, and so I'm extremely proficient when it comes to Google Analytics and ads and and all sorts of facets of conversion rate optimization, and got
Yeah.
involved in that pretty early on. And so I've got all of these things coming together. But have I ever just spent all day professionally on one thing, like coding out solutions? Not really.
Mhm.
And so my hat's off to the people that are really experts in that domain, that go above and beyond, and that do some really amazing things. Hopefully, I bring value in my own way by, helping to bring those things to market and connect the right people uh, and figure out the right things at the right moment, as more of that. I don't even know what to call me anymore, but you know, techie.
Director of Director of Partnerships and
That's
Alliances.
what they call me these days. Yeah, that's the title. I was never a huge title guy. I roll with the punches, so hard to say if it's always the right title because I'm used to doing more than one thing. Um,
Mhm,
and I think that that's part of the challenge for me. That going back to my agency days, I oversaw all of our e-commerce sales and strategy and partnerships and um, all sorts of different things that including on the marketing side. Going in there and identifying when something was stuck, something wasn't working the way that someone else thought it should be.
mhm,
Um, it's just you know and I think most agencies that are in the tens of employees, not hundreds, have a lot of the same experience that the leadership wears multiple hats in pretty much every case.
mhm,
If the place is running well, you can be pretty sure of it. And I think that going from that since then, getting into partnerships and alliances full time has almost simplified my day. But I think part of the fun of it and why the role works for me is that I'm always learning something new from our partners. I'm engaged at trade shows, even if this year they're virtual. I get to create content, and that includes research and leveraging some of the information and skills that I have. So I write by my standards, at least a lot of articles and participate in a lot of ebooks and create a lot of the written word. And I also host the Jetrails podcast and get to create audio and video content as well. Nothing of this caliber, mind you, but
I think no, man. I think you're really doing a great job. And by the way, let's just say this is the podcast since we've been getting fired up and getting going.
oh, now I'm in trouble. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what I've said. My filter wasn't on yet.
we can edit that stuff out,
No, that's
but
okay.
yeah, I was checking it out, and I love what you're doing, like the role that you're in, doing partnerships for Jetrails hosting company, and just bringing different people on to the show and kind of connecting. I think it's brilliant. I think it's really a smart strategy, and you seem to be in a perfect position to be doing it. Like you said, having a lot of skills and a lot of interests, and you can talk to a vendor and dig into SEO, dig into different things with them, and then talk to an agency, solutions partner. So I think it's a really good strategy that you have going.
I appreciate that. I'll absolutely take the compliment. I'll try not to blush too much, but it's a labor of love. I'm going to have those partner conversations in a lot of cases anyway to learn about their strengths, to learn about
Right.
what's going on market, how our users at Jetrails should be leveraging different tools and strategies, and figuring out how we can work with some of these amazing companies. And it's almost a waste not to get that recorded and not to share that with the world in that more direct fashion.
Hmm.
So it came up naturally, but they're typically when we go and interview someone, uh, we find some people ask to be on the podcast, others we invite on. It's a little bit of a mix. There's no advertising, so we're not really focused on that side of it. Most episodes don't touch on web hosting, so it's not out there specifically to look for a plug for Jetrails. We actually think it's a great resource for Jetrails users who don't need to know about who we are. They work with us day in and day out
Hmm.
as their vendor already. And so instead of all that, I'll sit there and I'll get a little bit of research time, and I'll figure out, what would a merchant really learn from? What would a website owner really learn from, or a website marketer, or an e-commerce manager, or someone in one of these roles? And not every episode is necessarily going to speak to every possible user out there, and we don't mind that. We figure that in the last less than 2 years, we've put out over 50 episodes so far, and we've got more in the can.
Hmm.
Um, that the real goal there was to say, look, we can be thought leaders in the space. We can keep some of these folks honest. And, I'm not a shock jock, but uh, we're going to ask meaningful questions and try to get at the heart of why they do what they do, how they achieve it, what's unique, what's different, what are some of the pros and cons, what are points of failure when users think something might really work for them. These businesses are banking on it, but something may fall by the wayside. And so we try to take all those kind of different things into account, put something cool together, minimal editing. I mean, I suppose if you were to go through the back catalog and listen to all those episodes, it would probably be a little bit like being at a trade show. And you get all these different sessions on all these different subjects, and it kind of all flows together. And I don't know if we knew that that's exactly how it would work out, but it's been fun.
Yeah, it's so crazy because I read your Medium post this morning, or your LinkedIn post this morning, where you talked about kind of why you did the podcast and your philosophy behind it, and the no advertising and the kind of informal conversation. I was like, this is like the exact same philosophy that I have on podcasts. And like you said, you enjoy kind of the informal conversational podcasts, and I'm the same way. Like those are my favorite ones to listen to, or the ones that are just kind of, informal, go all over the place, touch a lot of different topics, no advertising and stuff like that. And I was like, man, we really have kind of a similar way of thinking about, the approach to the podcast. And
Well, I suppose that you started first, and if I had to admit it, I'm sure I listened in to just a few episodes before I began. So you can draw any conclusions that you'd like from that, uh, uh, but there's definitely some great content going on, and folks like yourself have really been mastering the medium before I ever got to it, and so I think that certainly helped pave the way. But it's funny that when I'm on my own time and listening to podcasts, which I absolutely do, it's hard to get me to wash the dishes or do certain things without
oh
a
yeah,
podcast in my ears.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
what I listen to is really a mix of science and economics and comedy and all sorts of things. But there are a few choice ones in our industry, including and sometimes these are videos that I'll watch on YouTube or so there are differences in the mediums that are used. But TJ with E-commerceaholic is fantastic, and
Mm.
I've enjoyed the episodes that Commerce Party has put out, the team at Shipper HQ, and I'm this is going to feel like an award speech for me where I know that I'm going to miss somebody and they're going to be upset with me. But there's some really good ones out there that I do enjoy. But I'll also admit that I pick and choose episodes. So I find that sometimes there are topics where, let's say, there's a merchant being interviewed, which for me, when I go to a trade show, like I sit in on the sessions that are about product roadmaps, and I sit in on the sessions that are about new tech I haven't seen before. I remember when GDPR came about, and as much as it was painful to sit through some of those sessions, there were so many. I picked and chose, and I found that to be interesting. And there are some that I think there's always new highlights. So you look at multi-channel integration and omni-channel and unified commerce, and there are shifts in the market, and it's interesting to see when people come with fresh data what's actually happening, because there's so many legacy brands that have a hard time doing that stuff well. They've got old-fashioned point of sale in their retail stores. They've got now these online sales channels that don't really connect well. This year, a lot of companies have had really no choice but to catch up to it. But we've known those, and we've been watching those trends for a long time. So I'll sit in for a lot of that, but sometimes there'll be sessions that as a partnership person, I need to be out there networking, and I can't sit in on every session. And so I kind of find that when I pick those podcast episodes within the industry, that I follow the same lines, which may not be what the merchants would choose, which is interesting. That they may be a lot more moved by listening to other merchants up there on a panel talking about their trials and tribulations,
Mm.
where I've spent a lot of time with a lot of merchants and heard a lot of those stories, in some cases in more depth with some more colorful words behind closed doors
Right, right, right.
about things that have gone well and not gone as well.
Yeah.
And I continue to. And so I think that's interesting that we all try to figure out what our interests are versus how we can bring value to the larger market. And those two
Yeah.
things, just like everything else in our industry, are not the same.
I feel that tension as well. And I think, like, again, the podcast that I like the most are the ones where the host is just genuinely interested in the guests that they bring on and the topics. And sometimes the topics will go a direction that I'm not really interested in. And sometimes I'll get interested in the topic because I'm interested in the podcast. But I feel that tension of like trying to do stuff that is specific and valuable and actionable to an audience versus just the type of conversations I enjoy, like almost trying to recreate the hallway track at a conference. Like when I'm at a conference and I'm just talking to people, like we've talked at New York and things like that, and just random stuff, whatever comes to mind, whether it's talking about doing podcasts or talking about like the e-commerce vendor space or whatever. It may not be actionable to a merchant, but it's like you kind of got to focus on what you're interested in. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't know if it'll last.
Well, and a phrase that I use very often is, in e-commerce, it takes a village. That to run a really strong e-commerce program, you've got things that relate to payments and shipping and taxes on the checkout side, and you've got things, issues related to speed and security and scalability on the hosting side, and you've got front end communication and back end communication as it relates to things like live chat on the front, or perhaps email marketing and multi-channel marketing on the back end to keep people coming back and keep them engaged. And you've got all these things happening, and it's always changing. So the social media platforms that need to be interconnected, the way that shoppers are going to react to marketing, whether it comes to them through an email versus, let's say, SMS, which is an old conversation, but the numbers change. And so, as with everything else in technology, either you stay ahead of it or you don't. So, I think even for those of us that live and breathe it, we've got to put our heads together to understand where the trend lines are going, and we'll all individually see different things based upon where we are in the stream. So with hosting, we see immediately when there are increases in traffic and demand on sites. That's an obvious for us. But we don't necessarily see what the marketing plans are or what the investment is into the site, into what's coming next, until a little bit farther down the pike in so many cases. And so, what we kind of, uh, while anonymizing, while certainly, keeping confidentiality in play, we get to learn and anticipate and help be thought leaders. At Jetrails, a lot of our users, come to us through their web agencies that are building their sites, maintaining their sites. But a lot of our users don't have an agency; they have in-house developers, and they're not at all those trade shows, and
Mhm.
they don't always have all those contacts, and so they'll actually lean on us and our partner network. And what we're doing, they'll even send us to trade shows with questions to ask.
Nice.
So it's an interesting place to sit, and like I say, because it's always changing, you really can't afford to sit it out.
hmm And I think it's really smart what you're doing. Like you said, there's no direct Jet Rails ads on the podcast, and you just talk to a variety of people from vendors to agencies and things like that, and just talk about the things that you're interested in and stuff like that. I have some hosting companies that I'm friendly with and stuff like that, but I've heard recently a couple of people using. They just mentioned they were using Jet Rails, and I've seen your content bubbling up and stuff like that. And that's kind of the way it works. Like you hear a couple of times about somebody getting used by somebody and then you go, okay, interesting. Like and then those data points start to add up, and you go like, all right, this is they probably are doing a good job of it.
It,
So I think
it's
it's
and
smart, the way you're handling it.
well, again, much appreciated. We always hope that the strategies work out in the long run, because a lot of these things, when you go out there creating content and uh, and not everything goes viral. Not everything is going to be a home run. Not every interview is going to have the biggest impact or attract the largest audience. Uh, and so, if you go at it with a mindset of I'm going to really just give it my all and do something really valuable, over time, generally these kind of strategies work. I think it's the same for these same businesses, for these e-commerce businesses, when they think about their own strategies. And so, you don't write a blog post a quarter and expect to really move the needle on your marketing machine. Um, at the same time, you don't want to flood uh, all of your channels with a lot of, not to put it in too negative a term, but weak content that really isn't as impactful and won't serve the user, in the shopper, or whomever else, in the same way. So it's finding a lot of that balance. And for Jetrails as a brand, I think that we're in a really unique space. There are a limited number of web hosts that really do specialize in the e-commerce world in the way that we do, and a lot of those companies focus on SMB, on shared or multi-tenant hosting, where we're really all about dedicated hosting, single tenant environments, whether on servers or on the cloud. And so we're already speaking to a little bit of a different market segment than some. Now, for our podcast, our blog, a lot of the content is useful for anyone in the space. However, we do focus a little bit more toward that more established market of businesses that they've probably dabbled in some of these things. They're probably doing something already, and they could use information to hone their strategy, or to pick it up a few notches, a few pegs, put it in overdrive. And so I think that that's also a differentiator. There are a lot of podcasts that focus on how to get started in e-commerce, and we're really more focused on how to thrive with the e-commerce channels that you've already been building and engaging with.
Hmm. What type of customers are ideal for you guys as far as the size, the scale, the type of needs that they would have as a merchant?
So, we do service a few platforms, if you want to think about it that way. So, Magento is our number one by far,
Mhm.
but we're partnered with BigCommerce to service users that go headless and have a different front end running side by side with BigCommerce. We can also host custom apps, and so whether that's for Shopify users or BigCommerce or elsewhere, so all that certainly applies. And anyone that's basically in need of Linux based hosting, whether that's WooCommerce, Xcard, Press to Shop. But like I say, we found a huge alignment in the Magento community. It's where we're most active. Outside of that, we service some larger Drupal and WordPress sites, and again, some completely custom sites that really thrive in a Linux environment. So, in terms of who we're servicing, the technology stack is generally where it starts. From there, our team has clients around the globe, but most of them are here in North America. So you'll see a lot of our marketing efforts. We're focused on the English-speaking markets, where speaking about and with American and Canadian businesses, and that's where a larger part of our focus is. Even though we've got some great clients and great partners around the globe, in terms of size and scale, um, like I said, we typically start with dedicated server, and our larger users, we deploy auto scaling environments with AWS. Um, we can also help people with DigitalOcean. And so when we think about that, you're typically at a certain point. You're either an established company that has a site that you really care about the speed, the scalability, the security, um, the overall metrics, that are going to be important to you. Of course, scalability, or you need more flexibility. So we actually see a lot of users that come over from places like Magento's Commerce Cloud, where that's a more rigid environment, and it's certainly a growing market, but there are going to be those segment of users that need a higher touch support, that need more flexibility and tailoring and optimization in the environment itself. And so we complement well within the market rather than see that as a competitor. We really see ourselves as segmented and differentiated. Um, where I think some others see it as more of a head-on competition. For us, we know vis-a-vis members of Magento's team that they need us there to be able to service that segment that's not a fit for Commerce Cloud, um, and so we do see these different things. So it'll go from that more established Magento open source or other open source site that's doing typically on average into the millions in online revenue. Uh, and we service companies that are in the billions in revenue, and so there's really the sky's the limit on the upper side of it. And a lot of folks really they come to us for a more holistic approach to it. We do so everything that we do, generally speaking, and we do have like consulting services outside of just managing someone's hosting,
Mhm.
but a majority of our users come to us for fully managed, highly optimized hosting, where we're doing all the maintenance and management and monitoring. We're taking care of the content delivery network, the web application firewalling, intrusion detection systems, malware scanning, caching layers, off server backups, and DNS, and you know goes.
All the
It
goodies.
feels like every month, there's something else that's in the stack. Not necessarily because there wasn't already enough, but going back to that thought that the technology is always improving, and that we want to make sure that our users basically can sleep well at night, knowing that that's taken care of. They can focus on growing their business, and they don't have to worry as much about the infrastructure. We have a NOC, a network operations center, and we're monitoring these systems 24/7. So typically, if there is an issue, we're going to know first. We're going to alert the customer. We're going to be working together on mitigation, um, as opposed to the more mm, you know reactive style hosting that so many are accustomed to, where you're basically given a prefab environment and you're told, here, make your application work within this. If you need us, we're over here. We take the opposite approach, and we start by sizing them out, making sure that they get the right environment for their particular needs, optimizing around their application and going through a user acceptance testing procedure, and uh, and from there continuing to stay on with dedicated account management and other resources that are helping to track success and make sure that things stay healthy. So like recently there was an attack on Magento one site's card bleed, and we saw a lot of hosts, including big names, with slews of sites that were impacted.
Mhm.
Our security held steadfast. And so our network remained in good standing against that attack. And, I
My
mean, security takes
understanding
vigilance, but
Yeah, my understanding on that one is that it was related to the downloader,
yes.
having the downloader package directory in there, and
Yeah.
that like most people that are paying attention to their best practices are going to already have that disabled.
Yeah.
Is that something you guys kind of have disabled across the boards?
So that's precisely it, that we don't know why anyone would allow the outside world to get to the downloader folder or the Magento admin, whether on Magento 1, Magento 2. The same would apply for other CMS platforms. That should be whitelist access only. It should be firewalled and locked down. There's certainly lots of other assets like that, and if you're paying attention to PCI and other compliance, those things are important. Uh, but if within give or take a weekend, something like 2 or 3 thousand sites were impacted, uh, that says that even though a lot of folks are watching these things, not everyone is. And so I think one of the things that Jetrails customers appreciate is that they don't have this piecemeal impact where they're expected to go get their own firewalling and have their own malware scans and intrusion detection, all these other things one by one. And we know in the industry that a lot of the major security incidents that we all read about in the news, uh, they happen not because these big companies don't have good security systems to alert them when something's happening. It's because nobody's watching those systems. So what Target, Home Depot, whomever it is, they're getting alerts, but no one's acting on it. And so that's
Right.
an equally important part of the process. So whether it's for our users that are still on Magento 1 and have unique security needs as a result, whether it's for folks that are on fully supported platforms, when left to their own devices, security, a lot of these businesses don't have a chief security officer or someone that's in charge of compliance. They benefit from having a team that's going to handle it more holistically. And so that's, I think, part of where the industry is headed in general is looking for that. We've certainly found that it's been really well received in market.
Nice. I mean, I have to say, I think you were very diplomatic the way you described the Magento Cloud situation.
Well, I don't have to
I'm
use it on a day-to-day basis, so I can't speak from firsthand experience. I know that I saw a video recently you might have seen,
Shoost.
yeah,
Yeah,
Mark put out a good one, which I think shared his personal views and frustrations. I talked to a lot of agencies. We have a lot of partners that happen to also be Magento partners, and they share a lot of the same frustrations. I spoke to one this morning, to an agency that's not yet a Jetrails partner, but that was describing exactly the same thing. That when they bring a merchant to Magento, they'll advise the merchant on how to try to negotiate for an on-prem license at a more reasonable price. Because if they
they get
don't
like
go in
coaching
knowing
on
that,
license negotiation.
yeah, well, I think the way that some people have described it, it's almost like if the Magento sales team member goes back to the sales management team there with a piece of paper that says on-prem, they're going to have to do the walk of shame.
Right.
And
Right.
to us, I think that we recognize that Adobe made a major acquisition in Magento. We recognize that they are a major player in the space and will continue to be. And so, and we're thankful for our role in the Magento ecosystem and in the community. Our goal is not to butt heads. Our goal is not to be inflammatory or to go at it in an adversarial way. There's enough out there for us. We're quite happy with our growth trajectory, and we know that the Magento team will continue to strive for a better product. I don't think that they'll catch up to us anytime soon when it comes to the service layer. I mean, we pick up the phone within 10 seconds for anything and everything, and about 90% of the time, the first person to pick up the phone is going to be the person that resolves whatever request or issue. We cut out a
Nice.
lot of that kicking the can kind of stuff. It's the same with tickets, 15-minute response time. About 90% of the time, first person to touch the ticket is going to resolve whatever it is. It's a much more holistic support. Uh, I don't think that they're going to aim for that. They're a software company. They're not known as a service company. I think they're going to put out more tools. And it's going to continue to be a more self-service experience. And I think it will continue to get better. We know that we've been winning when it comes to the larger auto scaling where we're elastic. We don't just add CPU and RAM and resource. We automatically spin up more web nodes. We can really, really, handle some, humongous use cases where they've been working toward those things. We've been there for a long time. And so I think that there are these nuances to it. And there's also folks that need HIPAA compliance or that are in a category like CBD or that don't fit within the confines of what they intend to provide as they've gone to market. I'm sure things may evolve, but uh, they need folks like us to be able to handle that other side of the market that needs something more custom. That also includes if you were to go to the Magento marketplace, you're going to see a last I saw hundreds of extensions that work for uh, Magento Commerce, but not Magento Commerce Cloud. At least they're not certified as such. And we know that lots of software like WordPress, which is very common in the Magento ecosystem, which has its own security needs and its own challenges, but software like that is not intended to run in Commerce Cloud, and generally speaking, as far as I know, can't. It's not part of the terms there. Uh,
Mhm.
where we can spin up the right resources and handle those needs of organizations that have different resources and keep it all under one roof and in a way that is advantageous to the user. So there's a lot of those moving parts that are going to point someone from one place to another. Um, and the same way that we would differentiate when we were looking at other players in the market that certainly strive for a higher level service. I happen to think that our team is second to none. I work with some amazing people, but I know that there are users that are perfectly happy other places, and in that sense, we know we have strong competition in the market, and we've got our eye on the ball. And I think for us, one of the things that I really enjoy, like with Magento One End of Life, we partnered with Mage One and Open Mage and focused on folks that were going to provide patches, and we partner with Cloudflare and Sakuri and Sansec and lots of great companies that are going to bring value to these users, whether for security or speed or other needs, as opposed to trying to do it all under one roof and be the best at everything, which
Mhm.
is difficult at best, keeping my diplomatic hat on. And so that's also a differentiator for us, is that our users get to choose from best in class. And so they might have a preference of a certain CDN, or a certain WAF or something else in the stack. And generally speaking, our team is going to have some strong recommendations, but we'll accommodate, and we'll accommodate successfully. Uh,
Mhm.
it's We're built for it. It is a flexible stack.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that happening in market, where I think for healthy business reasons, a lot of businesses have gone in the opposite approach. It's how do we tamp this down as much as we can, and uh, make it less flexible, to keep down the support costs, to keep maintenance very uniform, to give everyone basically the same, the same stamp of approval on their PCI compliance and other things. Where for us, we know that users today that are choosing platforms like Magento that are open source, uh, I like to say that they're snowflakes. No two are alike. They are unique. They want to be unique. They want that flexibility. That's where they're choosing the platform, and so we lean in on that heavier service layer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm having a hard time. I've been thinking about this the last week or two because I've heard several times in a row from people about issues with cloud, and I think it's good. Like you said, you're trying not to be adversarial, but I go back and forth between part of me wants to raise these issues and scream it from the rooftops and be like, guys, there are some things you got to really pay attention to, and the other part of me is like, listen, I'm going to just not talk about it, let it go, and just assume that they're not going to do the greatest job with certain things. Because I don't want to be. I'm working on being less negative. I don't want to be like overly negative and like inflammatory and stuff like that.
I,
Um,
I like that my name is still not quite mud, and that I'm still welcome in most circles and places, and I intend to keep it that way. Not because I need to be, loved in some way, but because I think that there's a lot more for us all to gain as a community, especially as an open source community, by having open dialogue and by communicating effectively in healthy ways that move the needle. There are people within the Magento ecosystem that work for Adobe that I have check-ins with, and that we share feedback, including from merchants.
mm,
I've had merchants tell us that the sales team at Adobe will say things, and they call our team right after, like, to verify something. And hey, we were talking about going from Magento 1 to Magento 2, and they told us that there's no more community edition, that there's only commerce. Well, yeah, there is. It's not community edition. It's now called Magento Open Source, but there is an option. They've renamed it. Like, I could see where there'd be some confusion. Of course, I wasn't on that call, but I was talking to developers that have worked on Magento for years, and they were quite adamant about how this conversation went. Um, we've seen things like that where we want to be able to report those things back. We don't believe that those things are happening in a holistic manner. In some cases, I think that there are more conspiracy theories, and I try to avoid being sucked into that. We saw some of that come about. End of life for Magento One. People were getting notified by PayPal that they had to upgrade to Magento 2 or switch to something else because PayPal wasn't going to support them anymore. And what I heard on market were things like, well, everything except Braintree is being deprecated from the checkout in Magento 2. And there are reasons for that that are healthy of why that's happening in terms of deprecation uh, of old payment methods that weren't following new European standards and such, and that there was a financing program to go from M1 to M2 that was in partnership with Magento and PayPal. And so a lot of people, started to look at, well, they're doing a lot together. Is this a strategy to get people to upgrade to Magento Commerce? And is that really where they're pushing people? And in my head, I'm just thinking, I don't think anybody sits down in a boardroom and gets that between these two particular companies and gets that deep into it. From my perspective, someone over at PayPal in compliance saw a notice come over from Visa that said Magento 1 end of life is coming and there's risk involved for acquirers like PayPal, as they're
Mhm.
known in the payment industry. And so you have to do something. And I don't think, if I had to guess at this, nothing would have come through the sales side of it, that this all had to do with risk. And, finance people are very, very, very attentive to risk. That's almost their entire reason for existence. If they're not doing that well, we're all in big trouble. Um, so you see these things, and I try to stay on the happy path. I look at it and I try to, I think a lot of it's interesting to think about, but at the same time, it's the same with Magento Commerce Cloud. I think that a lot of it has to do with Adobe, for not unfounded reason, needing to recoup investment of the acquisition of Magento, and really seeing the hosting as part of that, and really seeing having more of a something closer to a SaaS play where they control the environment better. I mean, keep in mind, if someone's on Magento on-prem and they don't renew, they don't pay their bill, there aren't so many great ways for Adobe to turn off the license. They would have to, really, generally speaking, as far as I know, they'd still really have to chase after the user, uh, you know,
Mhm.
put them in for collections, do something along those lines, sue them. When they're hosting them, they can shut them down whenever they want.
Yeah.
They also, hypothetically, depending on how service terms change over time, they get access to more data. They can see trends. They can see things that they can't see when you host your site elsewhere, unless there's some strong call home feature that's getting that data back to Adobe. And so I can imagine, based upon the features that they've been adding to Magento post acquisition and the focus that they've had in terms of the product roadmap of Magento, that they appreciate some of that, knowing how Adobe operates, their other product lines. But being this open source community, I'll go back to the fact that I think that there are things that they'll do well, and there are things that they won't. And if nothing else, while I think that there are folks that just they're happy with a vendor like Jetrails and they don't want to go into the unknown, especially knowing that there are lots of users that haven't been as happy with that direction, that they'll follow their own happy path, and that makes sense for their business. I mean, you know, do you go and get a new car mechanic or barber or someone else in the service industry to save a couple of bucks? Not that often. If you've got someone that you trust, that you like, someone that's doing it well, you don't necessarily make that kind of a switch. And like you're saying, that there's certainly a lot of feelings in market about where that product is today, even though it's sort of bundled for every commerce proposal that's put out, every Magento Commerce uh, quote that's submitted to a merchant. Um, just because they're offering it, or just because it's bundled in, like the free toaster oven that you're getting here, doesn't mean that it's what you really need or want. There's going to be that grouping of users that are going to have need for something more like what Jetrails provides. So
Right.
I think that there's a lot of safety, and at the same time, a majority of users are still on Magento open source, and that within that community leaves us a lot of room for growth as well. I mean, truth be told, some of our absolutely largest customers are on open source,
Mhm.
and so size isn't always the reason that people go to commerce. Many at that point decide that they could build the handful of features that they might benefit from commerce themselves, maintain them themselves, use extensions, use third party integrations. And in fact, I mean, you and I have probably dealt with a lot of merchants over time that have, rather than get the enterprise license and go to commerce, um, that have gone that route, or the opposite, that they've gotten the commerce license, but they're still paying third parties for modules that compete with the features in Magento Commerce, because those third party systems that are dedicated to something, that do nothing but that something, might be a lot stronger at that and might
Yeah.
meet their use case more head on. That's not to say that there aren't lots of folks that I've advised through the years and continue to go for commerce, but I think it comes down to a spreadsheet and being able to say, look, we're going to get value out of this in the long term over the many years of paying licensing fees, versus sticking open source and utilizing what's available within the Magento marketplace and ecosystem and custom development. And sometimes, you find that that's going to point you in one direction or another, but it's not really an emotional decision. It really does come down to what your exact needs are.
Yeah.
And that gets lost on a lot of people.
Yeah. I'm interested in with the open source product and the association. I know you had the guy on from the Drupal Association, and I looked at a bit of that episode, and I'm curious. Like, I sort of wonder. Obviously, the Magento Association handles events, and I wonder if they might go a direction of more having direction over the open source project. And I was curious, like what you learned about the Drupal Open Source Foundation, and if there's anything that the Magento community can maybe learn from the way they're doing things.
That's an interesting one. I'll try to tackle it concisely as much as I know how. But so Drupal's around a long time. Open source CMS, content management system, uh, competes in the same space as a platform like WordPress, although on average it's used by larger organizations, universities, hospitals, nonprofits, large organizations. It has certain things built in that actually members of the Magento community would appreciate as a content management system, because it has a lot of access controls in terms of which admin users can get access to which features and tasks, and this way, um, you can really handle things in a neater, nicer way when you've got this bigger organization with more people logging in and making changes and adding content, and um, they handle multi sites better. It is a more traditional content management system at the heart, and then while it certainly has kind of like the direction that Magento has been heading in with PWA Studio and the newer, at least, GraphQL uh, APIs and the ability to go headless, you could use Drupal as a front end for, or excuse me, as the back end content management system for just about anything. You could also use it as a front end that you could use to more nimbly design front end pages and things, and have more control of that from data that's coming from somewhere else. So there are these different use cases, but as an open source community, I think that there's a lot for the Magento community to look at there. Um, I mean, given that Drupal has no paid enterprise version, the closest that they've got is Acquia, um, where you're getting certain extra facets, and so anyone that spends time in that ecosystem is going to see some of that happening, um, but overall it's really focused on the end users, and so you have all these large corporations. I liked seeing that some in healthcare, I'd have to remember, like Johnson and Johnson and Pfizer, are all submitting to the source code, and
Really?
competing companies with competing business interests and other things, but they understand that, at least from my perspective, just this is open source, that they can do it better together. They can move the needle better by all contributing to the source code, and they don't have to maintain it all themselves. So they can start like version one of a feature and let the community keep building it out and maintaining. And there's this larger effect. So by not having that commercial competition within the ecosystem, I think it makes certain things easier. The roadmap isn't controlled by specifically commercial interest that's trying to sell an enterprise license or that's reliant on it. I mean, again, I respect where Adobe sits within the Magento ecosystem, and the need to, as the parent there, to keep everything,
So, but
profitable.
with
But
Acquia, how is Acquia? It's not like an analog to an enterprise version of Drupal. Is it? It's an entirely
I
separate deal.
wouldn't. I think in some ways they've created value adds, and so that includes marketing solutions. So um, there are different facets that you're going to get from Acquia, including the hosting, and so there are users that go that route. Um, at the same time, they don't control the ecosystem. They don't, you know, there's a nonprofit, the Drupal Association, that plays a much deeper role. Uh,
Mm.
it's a not, it is a true nonprofit. They were actually hurting this year, and that's when Jetrails got more involved. I had been engaged with the community on a lighter level earlier in the year, and then I was planning on being at DrupalCon in the Midwest, which was supposed to be somewhere in May. And of course, that was canceled, and a lot of their revenue came through that event as a nonprofit. And so they
Oh,
were
okay.
hurting. And so we stepped up to the plate during their Drupal Cares initiative, where they were asking members of the community to donate and sponsor, and they had a great outpouring, which was fantastic to see. And again,
Mm.
not something that like Magento as a commercial organization could could do in the same way, but this seeing people really with this outpouring of support for a completely open source project, complete nonprofit. I thought all that was really great. They have a lot of the same challenges in continuing to architect the platform to be easier to upgrade. Uh, you know, we all know that Magento 1 to Magento 2 is not easy and not cheap.
It's a
And,
journey.
yeah, absolutely. WordPress has gone through some of this. Drupal is going through it. Everyone is working on opportunities to make upgrade paths easier, to make maintenance easier, but also to allow for more customization and more freedom. And I think that there's uh, so I think that's one of my favorite episodes of our podcast, bar none. That getting to chat with the CTO of Drupal was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot on camera, which I enjoy thoroughly. When there are episodes where I kind of think I know how it's going to go. I came to that one knowing I had questions that I was hoping to hear answers to that I really didn't know the answers to, and I've continued to stay even more involved in that community since. But I think that for anyone that it's wondering about the direction of Magento, I think that checking out that episode about where the Drupal community sits is a really interesting way to look at it, because I can foresee a day when Adobe might even hand over, uh, and folks like Ben Marks have talked about this in the past, might hand over Magento open source, the free version, to the Magento Association or some other entity. Um, we see in their marketing they talk about Magento Commerce more and more. They speak about open source as a version less and less. They are really focused on less so on Magento open source as the feeder program in their collateral and their marketing material. And that's not to say that they don't enjoy it as a feeder program and they don't enjoy the community effect of open source contribution through their community engineering program and the strength of getting integrations and extensions and things that happen because of the wealth of open source users, not just the minority of commerce users. And it's one of those all boats float scenarios where they're benefiting from that ecosystem. But I've been in tech long enough to know that I can't see a few years out. And so while I feel confident that Magento open source will continue to go strong, I can't swear who the steward of it would be a few years out.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know too much about how the Drupal Association works, and I gotta dig into that episode and get into some more detail there. But it seems like it makes sense for the open source project to be owned by that association, and I just don't know if that's the direction it's going to go or not. Um,
It's an undertaking, and I think as the Magento Association, which is a great organization, and if anyone's involved, as a user or within the Magento ecosystem and isn't a member, I highly recommend it. Uh, they've been standing up different partnerships and getting, sponsors in essence, and so there's some dollars flowing, and because in order to have full-time resources, because there's a nonprofit board for the Magento Association, and those are some amazing folks from across the Magento ecosystem, and they've got full-time jobs. They run agencies. They are involved, on behalf of corporations with maintaining these sites. They've committed an amount of time, to being on this nonprofit board. But
mhm.
in order to have enough resource to really move the needle, to be able to effectively manage an operation like that, they need a certain operating budget. And I think that they're on their way to it. I haven't gotten any, ultra recent updates on trajectories there. Um, but like most nonprofits, with the right resources, they can do a lot more for the community. And I don't know that their goal is to be the stewards of Magento open source, but I think that there are some folks that wouldn't mind seeing it happen when the time is right, if that comes to fruition.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I actually just had Danny Vercati on yesterday, and he's on the board, and so it was good. He was mentioning, couldn't get into too much detail, but that there might be some interesting updates coming around the pike. So that'll be interesting to see. Um, but yeah, it'll be interesting to follow the way that evolves. Um, what how are you feeling about the Magento community kind of just in general? A lot of people in the community are branching out to other platforms, other e-commerce platforms. You mentioned BigCommerce. Um,
I've seen a lot of
and
them, in some of those places. It's tech, so everyone's following the trend lines. I think that some have been on any side of the fence have been turned off by a platform, a partnership model of a platform. Some of these partnerships are pay to play. Sometimes you don't get the resources that you're expecting out of it. Sometimes the way that things shake out doesn't quite work out, but mostly it's servicing the customer. What does the customer want? What does the customer need? Magento, from my perspective, historically hasn't had the strongest marketing arm. They didn't need to. They got to the market early.
really,
They
I thought that their marketing was always pretty strong.
really,
Yeah,
I would have
like with the
pegged
events.
Shopify in recent years of, well, but the events were targeting people mainly that were already using the platform or engaged with it. And so to
Somebody's
me, I think that
knocking at the
they've,
door.
hmm, uh,
Yeah, what's up? Maybe it's Mason. Okay, go with mom. Sorry.
no, no, no.
Mommy's not here. Mommy's in the other room. Work from home. What are you going to do, right?
Absolutely, all of us. But so to circle back on that one, I think that Magento really relied on their open source community, on being an industry leader because they got to market earlier and built up more of a following earlier, and so they got to sort of enjoy the fruits of that. And if you went to an agency and you wanted to build an e-commerce site of some size and standing, they said, "Oh, we'll use Magento." And there was that time in the market where the agencies really started to really play that role, and Magento benefited from it. And if you were building a tech integration, um, you know, you were building a SaaS company and you wanted to figure out which e-commerce platform to integrate with first, you went to Magento. It was the lion out of the pack, right? It had that leadership role, and not to say that Magento rested on those laurels, but I think that there was a lot of, at least, and I may be slightly off track here, but I always saw it as needing to do less, uh, beyond in maybe to direct to merchant marketing, and relying more on the partner network, on the ecosystem and community to feed uh, the, the overall demand for the platform, where Shopify went right to merchants and, hit it hard, and really became a name that a lot of users just couldn't help but go check it out. And it wasn't necessarily better for them. There are users that absolutely it was, and I could, prognosticate about why better for one and not another. But and the same would apply to pretty much every other platform. Everything's got strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. There's always some gray area. But I think that some of these younger platforms, or at least younger in terms of building market share, um, did a better job of marketing directly to merchants and, trying to pull them in. Where a lot of folks got to Magento open source, which was free. How much could Magento spend to bring them to open source? Yeah. That was happening through the community, and that's a very different methodology and model as a business or organization. Um, so we've seen how some of that has, in essence, had an impact. And now that some of these platforms really do have a lot of market share, especially in SMB, I mean, that's the major change here, is that Shopify got the SMB market. Magento has continued to work farther up market and focus more and more heavily on mid market and enterprise. And other players have been, again, figuring out what their core focuses are, and in some cases doing quite a good job at it. But if Shopify had been around in the way that it is today, 10 years ago, there would have been more people choosing Shopify for those SMB builds, because we see, some of those folks that are still on Magento 1, it's because they invested heavily into a platform. They, uh, they haven't gone to Magento 2 because the costs of maintenance and what have you, or, the migration are too high. That they, if you're selling thousands, tens of thousands of dollars of goods a year, maybe hundreds of thousands, but not the best margins, which most retailers have limited margins. It doesn't always leave you a lot of room for the tech stack, and SaaS can really deliver on that SMB market, where open source can really have a really good total cost of ownership, and the flexibility that merchants are looking for as they get up there, into the millions in revenue, and there's a much bigger, much stronger use case. Um, and so there's been a lot of that happening, and I think that there's a use case, depending on the flexibility that you need, the features that you need, the expectations that you have, also things that come down to things like data privacy, security. When you go with SaaS, there was recently in the news, there were Shopify employees that were arrested by the FBI because they were stealing
Yeah.
data and selling it.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that, that Magento merchants don't have vendors that couldn't also do awful things. And I was very glad to see that Shopify made the authorities aware and did everything as it appeared, at least in the news, by the book, and that's fantastic. But the average Shopify site that I see uses a tremendous number of apps that get access to a tremendous amount of proprietary data, customer data, order
Yeah.
data, and who's writing those apps, who's maintaining them, where are they hosted, are they secure, even are they scalable? Will they hit a breaking point on Black Friday? Who knows? I still think that for a lot of these larger merchants, there's something to be said, for owning the stack, owning your data, having more control, having more flexibility, being able to edit and configure in a way that you want. I mean, it's now been a while, but we've seen folks in the Shopify space, like Mailchimp, have a falling out, and all of a sudden these users have no choice but to uh, you know change their email marketing platform. That there is no open source module to be had. It's access to Shopify's API. They own it. It's theirs. The same with Shopify rolling out different features that compete with their ecosystem, and that compete, um, with sometimes with merchants' interest in some cases. Charging folks for merchant services either for using merchant services or a penalty if you want to use your own. They have a business model. I mean, that's how they stay profitable, and there are folks that could say why they think that's good. I can see use cases across the board, but I think that when we look at these sorts of things, that you know uh, it's important to take a holistic look. If you're buying a house, you don't buy a house to be in it for 6 months. Closing costs, movers, also, I mean, by the time that you're done, it's uh, a house is never done, right? And I think the same of an e-commerce site. It's not fun to migrate. It's time consuming. It's expensive. Data doesn't always port over as well as you want. Features and things that impact customers, that customers don't want to be guinea pigs. They'd
Hmm.
like things to be stable and reliable. That a lot of these things come into play. So it's just figuring out what's right for the longevity of the business. What is that business going to be want to be doing in 2 years, or maybe even 3 or 4? Uh, and I think that the marketing rarely focuses as much on that from any of these platforms. It's more about, look at these cool features, look at this total cost of ownership of a month as opposed to years. Um, you know, they
Yeah.
don't really
It's
focus on security and data privacy and scalability and some of these other things in quite the same way in a lot of the marketing.
Yeah, I hear you on that. It's been interesting as I've been starting to kind of follow the Shopify space a little bit more than I had in the past. In the past, I was just Magento only for years, and I didn't want to hear anything about other platforms. I didn't want to think about them. Didn't want to know about them. And I've been starting to kind of follow the Shopify space a little bit. There's a lot of people moving up market with Shopify Plus. There's a
Hmm.
lot of cool stuff there. But it's interesting to see a lot of the dynamics play themselves out in that ecosystem that I saw in the Magento ecosystem, even though it's a completely different model. It's SaaS versus open source. But for example, extensions between conflicts between apps or
Hmm.
extensions,
Well, and the
or
hard part,
if not necessarily, like it's not like you're dealing with code level conflicts, but you're dealing with how are they playing with each other, or like you said, how is this one particular app going to scale? Where in Magento you had the same problem, but you were dealing with code level issues, right? So is this extension written well? Is it writing performant database queries? Um, Whereas in a SaaS app
you have the
mode,
yeah.
yeah, you don't have as much control, and then but it's funny because it's like the same issues in different ways
Yeah.
playing themselves out. It's interesting to kind of follow.
When you're dealing with Magento extensions conflicting, you've got a good shot that you'll be able to code your way out of that. Whether it's the extension developers that do it
That's
for you
true.
or your own developers, you'll get
That's true.
there. When it comes to SaaS apps, and this isn't specific, a lot of the things I've mentioned aren't specific to Shopify. Sorry, my friends at Shopify, for picking on you a little there, um, but in general, and I was involved in helping to build Shopify Plus sites before it was particularly popular. Again, perfectly good platform for certain use cases. Uh, but when those apps don't work together, you're pretty much up a creek without a paddle, because at that point, you're usually going to wind up trying to custom build an app. And by the time that you're done custom building and maintaining that app, you've pretty much written a bunch of your own custom software. Why didn't you just go open source? And I think that comes into play. So there are those use cases where someone has a very straightforward retail business. They're doing an amount of revenue and have needs that are commensurate with what the SaaS platform is going to deliver splendidly on. And that's fantastic. And I advise people to go to platforms like BigCommerce in those situations, and to work with these different range of platforms. And they have different strengths and weaknesses. Shopify, their front end theming, especially for like do-it-yourselfers, that sort of thing, is fantastic. For folks that don't have developers and that again just need something that's gonna do the job, that you can launch a Shopify site pretty fast on as a non-developer, and be reasonably satisfied. At the same time, if you're a more advanced user, you're going to use a lot of apps. You're going to run into conflicts. You may run into issues related to the API because that is throttled. It's not your site. It's not your hosting. It's theirs. And so there are challenges that you can easily run into. They have been opening up more, and I think that's an interesting thing happening in SaaS. That I heard the big commerce team talking for a long time about open SaaS and being able to
Open
marry
SaaS.
together. Yeah,
Yeah, I've
so
been
you
thinking
have
about that.
a lot
Yeah.
of API connectivity to go headless or to do these other things to give more freedom. Because for years, folks like um, I, Shipper HQ, wanted to be able to do things with Shopify's checkout in terms of offering different shipping options, and they were locked out of it because it was SaaS and the checkout was locked down, which may have some security and other benefits, but didn't allow for the customization that some businesses absolutely needed. Um, I'd argue that many businesses should have, and so there's you know I think the biggest challenge for a merchant is talking to the right people before they make a decision. That if you only talk to the sales team at Magento or at Shopify, obviously they're going to tell you why they've got the best thing since sliced bread. If you go to an agency that works on one thing and really doesn't have that additional experience, I think it's a challenge because it's hard to give that feedback. And in some cases, last I knew in Shopify's partnership terms and conditions to be a Shopify partner, they suggested that you couldn't recommend any other platform to a Shopify user. Uh, to which,
See, this is this is what I mean about these like dynamics in the ecosystem and the partner program. Like people criticized Magento of that kind of thing in the past, like all these funny backdoor deals with
yeah, I mean,
partners and
look,
stuff like that.
I'm told by Magento partners on a regular basis by these agencies that if they don't recommend Magento Commerce Cloud, Magento's hosting,
Exactly.
that they're not going to
Exactly.
see any leads moving forward. They're not going to be,
Exactly.
they're going to lose uh, benefit there from the relationship. And so there are hot button topics now. Who's enforcing certain things? Is it holistic across the board? Is it I mean, again, I want to go back to my earlier statement about not being a conspiracy theorist. I'll believe what multiple people are telling me is very directly happening, and that's being directly reported by other members of the community, and that's not really disputed. But at the same time, I think that these partner programs, um, they have a major impact. And so going back to Magento, the Magento ecosystem, I believe, is what fueled Magento's growth. It wasn't Magento's marketing. While yes, they had booths at trade shows, and yes, they hosted events, and yes, they did things. It wasn't that they had a huge sales team that was hitting the ground, reaching out to every merchant trying to get them onto the platform as a starter, or that they were, terribly engaged in the market to get every single user at least not consistently through the years. Uh, I think that the ecosystem has suffered, and I think that that's part of where we've seen more of these agencies look at partnering with other platforms and look at building other solutions. Part of it is that there are users. So let's say, I dealt with this years ago as an agency that, Magento 2 came out in the end of 2015, and it still should have been an alpha. Forget beta. It was rough. It was rough around the edges. It was new, um, and we had people that we were talking about builds with, and it was like, well, if we build you on Magento 2, I have to budget multiple because we're going to be debugging this for a while, and it's going to take longer to launch. It's going to cost more to maintain. There are things that there aren't extensions available for yet, new software, that we're going to need to custom write extensions for you. There's going to be a cost of being an earlier adopter. Nothing that we all haven't seen before in tech and other ways. Uh, and so their choice was go to Magento 1 or go to the go to Magento 2, but be a test dummy, um, and pay a price for that. Not just in time and effort, but in dollars. And so at that point, we really started to see more demand, and we'd already seen a little bit of it in Magento 1. There'd been patches like Soupy 6788. that changed some admin pathing, some routing, and so all the extensions needed to be updated. And there were, Magento sites that had dozens of extensions, and the hours that it took to download and update and test and deal with all those extensions, it was a lot of hours at agency rates to charge a user, and they got a bill that they weren't accustomed to. The same with SUPI 7405. There was it was a patch, not, if I remember correctly, my chronology, it wasn't that long after 6788, and it was a dud. It needed to be repatched. And so now people had to pay twice in a row in a short period of time. And we started to feel pushback from the market as more and more patches were coming out. And as they were, in some cases, less predictable in terms and more expensive to manage, where we saw that people liked the platform, but they weren't necessarily prepared to pay at US rates, at least. I can't speak for everyone else, but let's say we were at 125 or 150 an hour, depending on the year, that not everyone was thrilled about. And at the same time, SaaS was coming up. And so we found that those merchants that weren't thrilled, they were typically doing maybe a few $100,000 in online revenue. It didn't make a tremendous amount of sense to budget for the amount of maintenance needed. And so when it came time to look at going to Magento 2, also originally expecting Magento 1 was supposed to go end of life in 2018, um, the conversation became, and we advised as an agency, look, we can take you onto this platform or this, and we gave them a little bit of a look at which was better, and we had partnerships with all these different platforms, and I think it was an important experience, and so that happened early on. The larger users were absolutely going to stay on Magento, and some were going to start moving to Magento 2 sooner than later. Um, but a lot of this comes down to the specifics, like just about everything else in life. And so I can go back to those memories of having to sort through that, and really, that experience, led me as a leader of an agency to really expand. I'll add a caveat that we did a lot of digital marketing, so we were really pretty well balanced between the design and development side of the house and the digital marketing side, which is not as common in the agency
Right.
world. And so we were Google Premier partners. We were in the top 3% of Google ad partners in the world, and we, we did a lot of great stuff with SEO, social media, email marketing. And so we weren't completely reliant on the dev side for all revenue. There was a balance, but we could partner with any platform, because to run Google ads, I had strong relationships with teams at Miva, Xcart, um, all sorts of companies where we didn't necessarily do a lot of work building the sites. Um, we designed for the sites, but didn't do as much development. But we had great relationships with the teams, and we're able to really provide additional services, value added services, marketing services. And so perhaps, I already had my feet, my toes dipping into other waters, and it was easier because of that, that I knew what some of these platforms were up to and which were going to be strong at what. And so it was easier to have that relationship with the Shopify team and with the BigCommerce team, and to understand who was going to be a good use case and where. But that's always been a challenge for the market, and I think it still is to this day, that I run into merchants that make a choice, whether it's Commerce Cloud or whether it's going to Shopify or this platform or that platform or whatever it may be, that there's an amount of buyer's remorse or something. The grass is always greener on the other side. So they focus on the cool new, what on the pain point that they're going to resolve, and they don't really focus on all the other. They don't do a risk analysis. That's the missing component here.
Hmm.
I think that, at least when you get to any certain size or scale, mid market, there's really should be a risk analysis of, if I go with this platform, um, what are the cons, not just the pros. That I've found is a rarity in the industry, and I think a lot of merchants get get knocked around like a tennis ball because of it, from that they will go back and forth with platforms.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase it, a risk analysis, because merchants will go through platform selection and things like that. But I like that idea of, listen, you're doing a risk. It doesn't mean there's necessarily one platform that's going to be best, that's going to solve all your needs, but you're going to have to balance out all of the different risks and potential benefits. I like that framing. But Robert, we're at our time here. The kids are knocking down my door. It was fun to catch up with you. Where's the best place for people to find you online?
Well, they can find Jetrails at Jetrails on pretty much anywhere that you can think of. They can find me on LinkedIn easily. Robert .r at jetrails.com. Drop me a line. Love to hear from folks.